I guess I can say as a young person's perspective that the companies that are investing in creating flexibility and creative environments and that are promoting professional but personal growth as well, and that provide a safe space for learning are definitely on the right track. Believing in young people and their skills is crucial, as is giving them a chance even if there are other candidates with more experience. We've all been there. Everyone needs their first opportunity to show their worth. And ultimately, the companies that claim that they are working hard to attract this new talent hold significant power in including the younger generation.
Welcome to the Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. I'm really excited about our episode today because we're going to be diving inside the mind of the new talent that you all are seeking. I had the pleasure to meet today's guest at the Future of Field Service live event in Cologne in June, and it was wonderful to have her there to get her perspective, but also to see the people flocking to her and offering her jobs. So I'm excited to welcome to today's podcast Teresa Carneiro, who is a field service engineer at STEMCELL Technologies. Teresa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I would first like to thank you for inviting me for your podcast and for working so hard to give young women a voice in this industry.
It's my pleasure.
So I can start speaking a bit about me.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell anything you want to share about yourself, your background, and then we'll get into some of the points about how you landed in field service and what you're enjoying about it.
Sure. To begin with, I am 24 years old and I'm from Portugal. And previously, I've just been finishing my master's degree in biomedical engineering. And before that, I've done a bachelor's in the same area. And unfortunately, in Portugal, it isn't very appealing for young people that want to start their career right now. I've only looked for jobs outside of Portugal, and my goal was to work in Germany. Currently, I've been working as a field service engineer, as you mentioned, in Munich for the past almost 5 months now, in a company based in Vancouver, Canada, called STEMCELL Technologies, which is mainly focused in improving research reliability and making researchers' life easier overall.
Okay, excellent. What was interesting about you attending the Cologne event specifically, for folks that are listening that weren't with us in person, we had a session with Daniel Trebell from Thermo Fisher Scientific. And Daniel's actually been on the podcast before. So if any of you wanted to go back and listen to his interview, you could. But he was there to talk about some of the very specific steps that Thermo Fisher has taken beginning in Germany to improve diversity in their field force and specifically to bring more women into field engineer roles. And so it just was very serendipitous that you were in the audience because you were able to kind of lend some firsthand perspective to that. And so I reached out to Teresa after the event and said, our audience as a whole is working toward that objective and really struggling to figure out the best ways to bring in young talent, to bring in more diversity, to bring in women specifically. And so I know that they would value hearing from your firsthand experience. So here we are. So as you said, you've been in your field service engineer role now for about 5 months. So the first thing I want to talk about is what attracted you to this role and this work?
I think I would like to start by saying that one thing that I felt that was really lacking throughout my whole university experience was having some real examples of what it is possible to do after you finish your studies. And of course, you can do your own research, but having real life examples and people to talk about how their daily life actually looks like gives you a much clearer idea of what your own life can look like if you choose that path. Short story short, I had a friend that was working as a field service engineer. And when he described it to me, I thought that might be something that I really like to do, actually. This would give me the opportunity to travel, to be exposed to different environments. And it seemed like the type of job that is different every day, which for me was really appealing. And so that idea, I guess, just persisted on my mind. And when I graduated, I only searched and applied for these kind of roles. And eventually STEMCELL believed in me and in my background, and here I am.
Yeah, that's wonderful. But it's interesting. We have had a lot of conversations on the podcast about that. Oftentimes, the way we position it is field service has a branding problem. First of all, it's not a specific industry, it's a collection of a bunch of different industries, and that can be challenging. But also, it isn't a career that not only is it not shown by example in settings like you mentioned, but oftentimes it's hard for people to even picture what it is or what it could be. And so without having someone in your life personally that is doing it and saying, hey, you might actually like this, it's just something that I don't think lands on a lot of people's radars. And so I think one of the challenges companies have is figuring out, how do we create more awareness of this whole sort of career path for people earlier on in their education, in their lives, so they can see some of that potential. So another thing we talk a lot about on this podcast is that traditionally or historically, companies have hired field engineers based on previous experience. And we have talked about the fact that those experienced engineers are becoming harder and harder and harder to find because they're aging out, they're retiring. There's just fewer and fewer of them. And so that companies need to become more adept at hiring talent that has potential and then training up and providing that experience. And I know you said to me that when you were applying to roles, you did really feel that not having previous experience was a barrier for you. So can you just share a little bit what your experience was like in that regard?
Yes, of course. I think it is very curious because ever since I've actually joined the industry, I have heard all sorts of companies saying exactly how hard it is to get young talent in their teams. But I must say that having very recently searched for a job, I felt exactly the opposite. I felt that I was always behind because I didn't have any previous experience in this industry. And even when you come across some entry-level jobs, they often ask for years of experience. Yeah, it can be a bit discouraging to find that most job ads require some sort of years of experience, and especially in this type of role, because I feel that this type of job, you need lots and lots of training, regardless of your previous experience, because of how specific it is. And I truly believe that recently graduated students can bring a lot to the table. We are used to learn so many different things in such short span of time.
Learning was your full-time job for the last however many years. Yeah.
And the amount of detail we can retain is also really high, which I think is essential in this type of jobs. For me personally, and coming back a bit to your original question about my experience, I was doing research before, and I knew I wanted to transition to this industry. And fortunately, I have found a job that allows me to keep in touch with this research environment. As I've said, my company focuses mainly in helping researchers. And so for me, being able to bridge this gap between industry and research makes me feel really accomplished and that I'm doing something meaningful. And yet again, young people can bring so much more to the table than it might seem at first sight.
Yeah. And you made a good point when we were chatting. You said not only what you just said, which is people that are coming out of school are really in that learning mindset, but also that they're moldable, right? When you have someone that has 10, 15, 20 years of experience, they're also coming into the role with maybe some bad habits or some really firm opinions that, if that doesn't fit the new role, have to be overcome. So there's clearly pros and cons, but as we've stated on this podcast before, I think companies that refuse to see the need to recreate that process and how they're looking and what they're willing to do to train internally are really going to fall behind. All right. So I think one thing I wanted to ask you on that is, so for STEMCELL, where you landed, what was different in their approach? Was it just that, like, were you applying for those roles even though they were asking for experience and you didn't have it, or did you just not apply? And then for STEMCELL, were they just not requiring experience?
For me, at first, when I started to apply for jobs, I would be very specific. If I don't meet the requires, I would not apply. And then I started to understand that I cannot go this road and I need to apply and then prove myself in the interviews. because my curriculum might not be what they're looking for, but if they meet me, I might change their minds. And that's what happened. So for me, I had not only the experience side of things, but I also had the language side of things, because most ads asked for German, which I also don't speak very well yet. And so STEMCELL did ask for German, and I cannot remember, but they might have asked for some years of experience, nothing crazy. And I applied anyway, because I figured, what do I have to lose? And I encourage young people to do the same. And whenever I'm talking with friends that are searching for new jobs, I always say, apply even if you don't fit every requirement, because it might change their mind when they meet you and talk to you.
Yeah. No, it's a really important point. And I think there's obviously research that shows when we're talking specifically about trying to bring more women into field service roles, women are less likely to apply for jobs where they don't match all of the criteria. So one, I'm really glad that you did that anyway. But two, companies need to think about the fact of who they are leaving out when they're creating their job postings. Okay. What I want to talk about next is, I know you're still pretty early in, but what do you find you enjoy about the role?
I would say that my favorite thing so far is having the opportunity to be exposed to different labs. This early on in my career, I believe that having the opportunity to create so many contacts and be exposed to so many different environments is a big advantage for me and a great learning opportunity. Of course, the traveling that this implies is also a big highlight for me, as I do love traveling. And having the opportunity to visit countries, not only Germany, but also other countries in Europe, is also a big plus for me. In this job, I also like to talk to people and establish communication with our customers. I like to see this job not only as servicing machines, but also listening and understanding our customers, which in my case are researchers. And I think this is where my previous experience in research really gives me leverage, because I can relate to them and I can understand their urgency. And I guess the other thing I would like to mention is the flexible work hours. I like that not every day is the same. Like on the same week, I can have some days working from home, others traveling, and also some days in the labs. So not having that regular 9-to-5 job at this point is also one of the reasons this role is so appealing to me.
Yeah, those are all great things. And you also mentioned earlier, and I think we hear this a lot, particularly when you think about generational differences in the workplace. There was a point in time where, and some leadership and companies are still in the mentality of pay being the only thing that matters, right? That was the most important thing. It was really the only thing. Obviously, it remains very important, but you also mentioned earlier that for you, because you care so much about the research world, having this role that kind of builds that bridge gives you that sense of purpose. And I think that's something that we hear a lot with younger talent, that they want to feel like what they're doing matters. They want to feel like they have a purpose. So again, it doesn't have to be your particular industry. It can be a number of industries. I mean, service in so many ways is what keeps the world running. But I think for organizations who are trying to reimagine how they're positioning roles and how they're hiring for roles, keeping in mind that money isn't the only thing people are looking for. They're looking for flexibility. They're looking for that sense of purpose. They're looking for some of these different things is really important to balance out that employee value proposition to bring in different people.
The younger generation is more and more concerned with work-life balance than the previous generation was, definitely.
Yeah. And so flexibility plays a big role. And so does, and we're going to talk about this a bit as well, leadership style. There's a lot of different elements to consider. But before we get to that, what challenges have you faced?
I would say that so far, I've not really faced any big challenges. As I've mentioned, I've just started not even 5 months ago. So far, everything has run pretty smoothly. However, all of my visits so far have been joint visits, as I'm still in training. And I guess that another thing that might make me feel more comfortable and secure is that I work mainly with research labs, where in contrast with field service, there are a lot of women working. I feel that compared to other industries, this one might be a bit easier to fit in as a woman, even though all of my field service colleagues are men. I would say that The only comment that has stuck in my head was nothing big, but was when I visited a lab with my manager the other day, and I was introduced by him to the lab manager as the new person responsible for their lab. His first comment to my manager was asking if he would keep tagging along regardless. Of course, this makes you think if the customer is going to trust you, or because of my age or whatever, they might be a bit skeptical of my skills. But then again, it can be that they are just happy with my manager's work. And when you're happy with someone's work, change is not always seen as a good thing, you know? Yeah, I don't want to make any assumptions. But it was the only thing that I could think of.
Yeah. No, and I'm really glad that your experience has been positive. But we did dig into this a little bit when we were chatting, because I think your feeling was more so that that comment, if anything, had to do with age versus you being a woman. And it doesn't necessarily matter, but I do think your observations are spot on. And I think the reason that I wanted to ask this question isn't to make any assumptions or anything like that, but more so just remind folks that when you're trying really hard to bring in new talent, we can't get them in the door and then stop thinking about it and assume everything's going to be great. We do have to think about what is that experience like for them. And that brings us to a bunch of different points. When that talent is different in any way from the traditional talent, we do need to think about, okay, are they being welcomed by internal teams? Are they being treated well by customers? We need to think about the leadership. So your manager, in that moment when that was said by a customer, that person's response matters a lot. You know, if they make a joke about you, you could feel a certain way, versus if they show confidence in your abilities, you're going to feel more empowered. These all seem like these very little things, but for a new employee that is already new, so there's always that getting adjusted and maybe being a bit nervous. It's a new role, it's a new experience. They're different somehow than the existing or traditional workforce. These little things can matter a lot, particularly if they're occurring on a frequent basis. I think it's really important for managers to stay tuned into what is that experience. Is there, and the way I'm asking you what challenges, managers should be asking all new employees on a regular basis. How are you feeling? What are the challenges? Is there anything you need help with? Because these aren't things either where every employee is going to come running back and say, so-and-so just said this, or this made me uncomfortable. Oftentimes they'll keep it quiet because they're trying to fit in, right? But then it can cause challenges. So I'm really glad that your experience has been positive so far. And I just bring this up because I think it's an important point for people to think about. That being said, is there anything, knowing that you've had a very positive experience, is there anything you think is helpful to share that you feel your company has done well to make sure that you feel welcome, you feel enabled, you feel prepared to do those visits and learn and eventually get out on your own?
Yeah, I can start by saying that from the first moment, still during interviews, my manager expressed a good concern regarding me being a woman. Like, he included a woman during the interviews, even though if she was not in field service, he wanted me to feel comfortable. So there's always been that concern, and I do really appreciate it. I've been really feeling protected from the get-go, and I feel that my company's culture is overall very welcoming. One thing that I really appreciate is that my team, everyone is super available to include me and have me joining customers' visits. They always take extra time to explain and train me properly. They never make me feel like a burden or like I'm delaying their work or making them stay longer or anything. I think that the other thing that was also reassuring is that I was never given a time limit to when I need to be ready to start going alone. So my company has always reiterated that I will only go alone when I feel comfortable and ready. And that's, of course, super reassuring because I can take my time and be very confident before I start going alone.
Yeah. Two things on that. And one thing I want to say, I don't think you'll take offense to this, but I think when you say concern, that word could be a little bit misleading because it almost gives a negative, it's more awareness, I think is what you mean. Like it's, because it wasn't concern where he was worried. It was concern where he was conscious of wanting you to be comfortable. I think there's just a way that can be done very well. And there's a way it could be patronizing as a woman. Do you know what I mean? And so I just want to point that out because those, again, are the little things that matter a lot. The other thing I wanted to say is knowing that in their job posting, there was small experience requirement that you didn't meet, but you were obviously brought on anyway. So in the training process, have you felt that as a challenge at all? Or do you genuinely feel like you are just as equipped as someone who would have come in with any experience?
Yeah, I definitely think that with all the training, I've had 2 intensive training weeks in Canada, in the headquarters. And with that, I feel really equipped. And all of the subsequent joint visits also made me sure that I'm ready. I feel that, as I've said before, the training is so specific that even if I've had previous experience, it would not help me necessarily with this equipment. I don't think that would make such a difference. I don't know, maybe in a few years if I choose another job, I will have a different take on this. But for now, no, I don't feel that having previous experience would make that big of a difference.
Yeah. I would imagine that is accurate. And I think it's just another important reminder for people of how many great candidates they're leaving out if they're continuing to hold that requirement, even when it is specific. Now, going back to the conversation at the Cologne event and the previous podcast with Daniel, there are instances where, if you remember in his conversation, they were saying that there was a specific requirement that they have for their role that is one of the reasons, a certification, one of the reasons that they had previously required that experience. And so when they realized, though, that that was a barrier to bringing in people that didn't already have experience, they split the role to where there was more of a truer entry-level role where that certification wasn't necessary, and they bring people into that role, then they can certify them while they're working to be able to do the second piece of that as well. So my point being, if there are true requirements like that, there's always a way to provide them or to work toward them. It's just a matter of companies being very stuck to the way they've always done it versus being willing to reflect or to try something different. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, Teresa, is your views on empowerment. So we talked about enablement, you coming in out of a school setting, you feeling like you are being trained well, you're being supported well by your teams, you're not made to feel a burden, you can take the time you need to feel comfortable going on your own. But I think the other important piece, particularly today, is leaders who are focused on this sense of ownership, the employees feeling confident to do the job well, but do it in their own way and bring their own personality to things, bring their opinions and ideas to work, etc. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think that at this point, at least for me, this question's answer is highly dependent on who my manager is and how much freedom do they allow. And I've currently so far been really lucky with my current manager because there is no micromanagement whatsoever. And of course, this gives me all the freedom I need to organize my day, organize my trips in the way that it suits me best and makes me feel more comfortable with it. And I think that the sense of ownership that you mentioned comes mainly from, of course, being given the tools that you need, but also having the freedom to explore the way you're most comfortable doing things and tackling issues in your own way, even if it's not the way other people are doing it. I guess instead of just being told how I need to approach services, I have also been given space, and actually I've been highly encouraged to, ever since my first training in Vancouver, I've been highly encouraged to find the way that it's the best way for me to carry the services. I feel that in that sense, they really invest on making the employees feel that they can do the things on their own way, and everyone can have a different way to do things as long as they are done well and on time.
Yeah, there's standards, but then you're given a creative freedom to build your own relationships and bring your own personality to it. And I think this correlates back to some of the things that you have said that attracted you to the space or that you enjoy about the role. You find a sense of purpose in what you're doing. I think it's really hard when you have employees who have that sense of purpose and they have drive and they have passion about what they're doing, but then you have a manager that's telling them basically to be a robot and to do things in this uniform fashion. And no, I don't want your ideas. This is how it's done. Then you're not creating an environment where, one, those people are going to want to stay, but two, they can have the impact they're able to have on the customer experience. Yeah, I would point people back to, there was an episode of the podcast that was with Venkata from Bruker Nano, and we talked a lot about his leadership style. And I just feel like this idea of empowerment and that building that sense of ownership is so important in actually getting the most of today's talent once they've come on board. So I'm really glad that you're having, again, a positive experience, though. That's good. Okay, Teresa, so when you think ahead, I know, again, it's still early on, so some of these questions are probably a little hard because you're like, I'm still getting up to speed. But I mean, obviously you have your own goals and dreams and objectives and whatnot. So when you think about the potential growth that could exist for you for a career in field service, how do you envision that?
As you've said, to be honest, like, of course, I've given some thought to that, but as this is my first job and it's super early on, I've mostly been taking the opportunity to learn as much as I can right now. And once I'm more settled, I'm sure I'll give way more thought than I have to this question. But to quickly answer, I think that over time, I just hope that I'm given more and more responsibility, that I am trusted by my team, and that perhaps I'll be able to train people when it comes to it. And of course, the possibility of managing a team would also be interesting. But then again, I'm not saying that I'm staying in this field forever, but yeah, it's a possibility and it's interesting possibility.
Let me word it this way. When you came into STEMCELL, when you interviewed, when you came on board, throughout your sort of orientation and training, like, have they presented to you what growth could look like? Or is it still just focused on this role specifically?
I think it's pretty focused on this role specifically, but I do have some close examples that started as field service engineers and now have higher positions in the company. They are always open to that. But I've also been given this advice, which is, if you don't want to be a field service engineer for the rest of your life, don't do it for more than 5 or 6 years. Otherwise, you might want to be stuck at this. And then I might want to explore different roles. I don't know. But I think there is a possibility to grow within the company. At least that's what I feel right now. But yeah, it's not on my plans in the near future, at least.
You're getting situated. That makes sense. I think this is just another thing that we hear a lot in conversations about talent, is that particularly younger talent coming in, they want to progress. So that doesn't mean, I mean, you're 5 months in, obviously. I'm not saying you're there yet, but it's important for companies to have the understanding that, again, historically, technicians or engineers would come into the company and they might do that role for 30 years. We need to understand that the majority of talent today is not going to want to do that. They're going to want to do it for a few years and have an opportunity for growth and evolve. And so, number one, I think just understanding that reality is important in how they orient their organizations to account for that. And then number two, there's been different conversations I've had of how companies are working to show new hires that potential when they come in, so that they know it's there, they can work at their own pace, they can be as motivated to progress or not, but that they know that that potential exists within that organization, versus them being in that role for a couple years, getting bored, and then jumping to a different organization. So it's just another point to consider. But it's also good to hear that you're not like, I think there's also this misperception that young talent has this unrealistic desire to just come in to a field service engineer role and be CEO in 6 months. You know what I mean? And it's also maybe dispelling that myth that you're saying, hey, right now I'm just focused on doing this job well, and then I'll think about what's next.
Of course. But don't get me wrong. I'm not thinking about growing right now, but of course there's something that's an ambition, of course. But I know these things take time, and I'm not in a rush. And as I've said, I'm taking the opportunity to learn as much as I can right now. And that's my main goal now. But of course, that's on my mind. And I think it's good for people to be ambitious.
Yeah. It's also another important point back to the importance of good leadership, because a lot of those conversations, sure, someone can show you a chart when you're getting hired of what the different growth potential is, but that's not relevant at that moment, right? You're focused on coming in to do the job you were hired for. It's having those having that relationship with your leader, having those interactions, having them not just saying, are you doing a good job? Great. But how are you feeling? What are your goals, et cetera, over time? So yeah.
Of course.
Okay. So here's maybe a tough question for you. We talked about some of the things that you enjoy about the role, and, you're young. So have you thought about how the things you enjoy a lot now could change in other phases of your life and how you might navigate that?
I think that this is where you want this question to go. I think that when I picture my phases of life, what's next, or not next necessarily, but in the future, is having a family eventually. Of course, this is the kind of job that makes you think how it will be when you have a family, because you have to travel a lot. And so whenever I meet someone in this field with a family, and especially with little kids or babies, it really inspires me and makes me think that it is actually possible to have and do both. However, of course, I have no idea how my life is going to look like in a few years. And I don't know if I will enjoy traveling as much as I do now, and especially spending so much nights away from home. Finding out that some companies, specifically Daniel, that you've already mentioned, are already investing in finding solutions for people that do want to be in field service but do not wish to travel as much as it usually implies, is really heartwarming. Like, it gives me hope that companies are more invested and creative in finding solutions for different types of people and in finding ways for more flexibility in these fields. And still in this topic, I would just like to quickly point out that these questions about balancing this type of job with parenthood are often framed as exclusively a woman's problem, such as, how do you see yourself managing this lifestyle when you become a mom? And of course, you did not frame it that way, nor did you assume that I do want to have children, which is also not an assumption that should be made for every woman. But this balance is not just a woman's problem. This might be a concern for anyone who wants to start a family and knows how much time we spend away from home in this type of job. So companies should tackle this problem and get creative, having everyone in mind and not just women.
Absolutely. Yeah. You said when we were talking about this, it's a consideration, but it's just as much a consideration for my partner as it is for me. And I love that. Now, I will say, I get inspired hearing you say that, because it shows the change and the growth in thinking. I'm 42. I have 2 sons, and I have traveled throughout my career. And I am still often asked in 2024, who's taking care of your children? And I'm like, their dad, And it's unfortunate, but it is still very much a reality. And I think that's why I wanted to bring it up. So there's a few important things we talked about. Number one, and I said this at the event, I have been asked questions before as a woman and as a mother of, we need more women in service because they're nurturing, or we need to think about this or this. And we need to be very careful of assuming that all women want to have children. That's just not a reality that we should assume for a variety of reasons. That's number one. Number two, to your point, we need to be creative and think about how we bring in more flexibility and more options to field service roles for everyone. Because the only way that this continues to evolve and get better is if it's possible for anyone to do it. The more we think about it through the lens of how do we make it easier for women, all we're doing is reinforcing the mentality that it's a woman's job alone to have that consideration. I read this quote recently. I think I shared it on LinkedIn. It made me think so much, but it said, giving women more opportunity in the workplace without expecting more from men at home is not empowerment, it's exploitation. And I absolutely love that. And that's coming from someone who, at least for my age, is in a pretty egalitarian relationship. But the beliefs, the things that are really deeply embedded are really deeply embedded, and we have to continue to challenge those. So I'm really glad that you bring up that point. And also really glad that you said my partner is thinking about this just as much as I am. The other thing I wanted to reinforce that you said is for a woman or a couple that does choose to have children, it also doesn't automatically mean they don't want a role where they travel. Yes, some people might decide they don't want that anymore for any reason. Some people just get sick of it, even if they don't have kids. Or they might decide one doesn't, whatever. But to your point, you said that when you see people doing it, it's inspiring to you. And so I also want to kind of reinforce for listeners, there is no rule that says once someone has a family, they don't want to travel anymore. So I think the lesson here is, one, not to make assumptions, and two, to think creatively about how we can build different options into the work structure so that it can fit a variety of different needs and we can have the greatest success possible bringing in good talent and retaining that good talent through different phases.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for complimenting what I said in such a clear way. Yeah.
Well, I'm very passionate about it as well because it's a really layered topic. And I will admit, I've admitted this many times, like as a mom, I do have guilt for being gone. And I'm not saying I should, I'm just saying I do. And so when I'm away from my family and there's stuff going on here and someone makes a comment like that, it's not easy to just brush off always. And so I think that I want to see that change. It doesn't help anyone to continue to reinforce that thinking. And I think there's, with your generation, a huge wave of change coming because of the work that my generation and others have done, right? We're building on it, but it just takes time. So,
of course.
Okay. Any other advice you would offer companies who are really working hard to bring in new talent? Things you can think that they should do, things they shouldn't do. From your perspective, having recently gone through this, is there anything we haven't touched on that comes to mind that you think it would be good for folks to be thinking about?
I don't, of course, have a recipe or anything about what should or shouldn't be done, especially because I'm so new to all of this. I might have some more insights as I gain more understanding of this industry. But I guess I can say as a young person's perspective that the companies that are investing in creating flexibility and creative environments and that are promoting professional but personal growth as well, and that provide a safe space for learning are definitely on the right track. Believing in young people and their skills is crucial, as is giving them a chance even if there are other candidates with more experience. We've all been there. Everyone needs their first opportunity to show their worth. And ultimately, the companies that claim that they are working hard to attract this new talent hold significant power in including the younger generation. I don't know, it's also very good that companies are showing more and more concern in having a more diverse team. And for example, I think that for including women, it might be easier to look in the younger generation. As we've discussed, there are way more female engineers, for example, nowadays than there were before. So if you really want to make a change, you need to go on all fronts. And also one thing that I think that field service industry can take advantage of is that they're offering a different type of routine compared to more traditional jobs. And I believe that nowadays young people are craving for a more fast-paced environment. They are keen to learning from different environments at the same time and from different people. And so having a more diverse experience overall is appealing to young people. And I think it's something that field service can bring. I think that highlighting this aspect of the job might be a good way to attract young people.
Absolutely. So I feel bad going back to something because that was such a good conclusion, but I did just think of one thing that you brought up that I want to touch on because I think it would be helpful for listeners, which is you mentioned in that variety. So you just kind of mentioned it. You said that you travel, some days you're in the lab, some days you're working from home. And so I wanted to ask you, is that because you're in training or will that be the same when you are on your own? Will you still have days you're working from home and you'll have days that you're traveling, days that you're in the lab? And is that something that will be the same throughout?
Yes, the routine will be almost the same,
Okay.
Meaning there are really no routine, but I will have days at home, which might involve getting some paperwork done or getting involved in some other projects that a company might have going on. And then, of course, travel days sometimes take the whole day. But yeah, days from home are also good because, of course, you're not looking at your computer, waiting for an email to drop at all seconds. So it also gives me the opportunity to explore other hobbies and gives me some free time that I think that in a regular 9-to-5 job, again, you wouldn't have the chance to explore this other side.
Yeah. No, and I wanted to go back to that because a lot of times we think about these roles as, even if it isn't travel, like get on an airplane or get on a train, it's just like in the car. It's from Monday through Friday or whatever the schedule is. It's boom, 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 right? And don't get me wrong, there's different service environments based on different industries. I understand that. But I do think maybe in your industry, that sort of variety is more naturally occurring. But even for those it isn't, where there's this daily demand for service job after service job, thinking about, is there a way to rotate or split work where you can build in some of that variety, where maybe 2 days a week, technicians or engineers are doing remote service from home and 3 days a week, they're traveling or something like that. Again, going back to your point of just being conscious that flexibility, that creativity, that variety is very important. I just want to challenge people to think about, I believe there's always a way to provide more of that. It's just a matter of whether you're willing to do things differently or you're trying to fit today's talent into a very outdated mold. So I just wanted to go back to that because we're seeing more of that as companies adopt more remote service capabilities. They can have engineers working from home a couple days a week doing remote service and then be on site. And I think, again, we talked about travel can be incredibly exciting for a while, but I think for some people, it will get old regardless of what the next phase of life looks like. So just having options for different ways to, different roles to offer, different ways to build schedules, different alternatives is, I think, really important for the future.
Yeah, me too. And that's why I mentioned Daniel's work, because that's the more familiar work I've been with so far. And it's really what I hope in a company. And it's creating that space for you to be comfortable with whichever phase you're in and having that flexibility. So you're not traveling all the time, or you can spend some time troubleshooting at home. You might also like that. So yeah, given that choice it makes you happier. And overall, I think that having your employees happy makes your customers happier. So it's all a big cycle.
I just thought of one other question. We're going to keep going. This is going to be like a 3-hour episode. I'm just kidding. Last one, I promise. So there's major, major buzz everywhere right now about AI. So I want to ask, from the perspective of a young field service engineer, how do you feel about AI?
I feel that AI can be a really good tool if you know how to use it and if you are aware of its limitations. I think that it's still evolving. I have to be honest, I'm not an expert in the subject, but we did discuss some really interesting things in the event we met. And there were discussions of having these interactive videos where you can ask questions, because with training, everyone knows that if you don't have customers that have that specific machine and you don't go there very often, you might forget. So I think that AI can be a really good tool for training, for example. But of course, you need to acknowledge there are limitations. At least for now, it's not 100% reliable, of course. And everyone needs to be aware of that.
It's not something that makes you fear for your job.
I think it will complement my job. I don't know if it will grow fast enough. I'm sure it will grow very, very fast, but I don't know if it will grow fast enough for, again, I don't know if it will be 100% reliable ever. So I think that having the human input is always good, and it can be a great tool to complement that work. But yeah, I would like to believe that we are still needed in the long run.
Yeah, I agree 1,000%. I don't see a time, regardless of how sophisticated it becomes, that we don't need to think about it as how it complements human effort versus overtakes it. But I was just really interested to ask your perspective, because it's something that I think sometimes, and maybe it's more threatening for people that have been in the workforce longer that see it as such a massive change. But I think it's important for us to think about how we put people at ease of looking at it as a tool to help them in their roles, not looking at it as a threat. Okay. Thanks for letting me ask you a bunch of questions that I was curious about. I absolutely loved it. I appreciate your perspective. I'm very excited to see where your career takes you because you're going to do amazing things, and we'll definitely love to have you back at some point.
Yeah, thank you so much again for the invite. I really enjoyed our conversation. It's always great to hear your inputs. I think we have very similar intakes in some of the main topics, so it's good to have this podcast to have continuity in these topics.
Yes, thank you for being a part of it. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah.
You all can find more by visiting the home of Unscripted at futureoffieldservice.com. I will try and make sure we link in the show notes the episode that we did with Daniel at Thermo Fisher and Venkata at Bruker Nano that we mentioned in this episode. The Unscripted podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more at ifs.com. And as always, thank you for listening.